The morning the
Officer!
bus disappeared,
The bus
my
is
phone
stuck!
exploded with
Please help
messages,
me!
and every one of them blamed me. Snow hammered the neighborhood like a drumline, piling into white walls overnight. I had already warmed up the plow, already traced the streets in my head, already tasted the coffee that comes after a clean run. Then the email arrived from the HOA. Access revoked, equipment banned, liability concerns, thank you for your service. 3 sentences ended 5 winters of early mornings. Every flake felt like a verdict, and every silence from the board felt louder than the storm outside that night for us. I stood at the garage door, engine idling, watching flakes erase yesterday's tire tracks. I could have rolled out anyway, could have played hero, could have pretended their rule didn't apply when kids needed a road. Instead, I shut the engine off. If they wanted control, they could own the consequences. By noon, the storm thickened into a blur, and the streets turned into narrow tunnels of ice. At 2:47 p.m., the school bus tried to enter. It made it past the sign, past the mailbox with the crooked flag, and then stopped like a stunned animal. Wheels spun, diesel coughed, and the driver radioed for help that couldn't reach him. Parents gathered at windows, then at doors, then at the curb, wrapped in scarves and opinions. The HOA president arrived with a clipboard and a voice tune for meetings, not emergencies. I watched from my porch, shovel resting like a question mark against my boot. The bus horn sounded once, a small, embarrassed cry. A child pressed a mitten to the glass. The wind sculpted the drifts higher. Someone yelled my name. I didn't move. You might think this is a story about revenge. It isn't. It's about rules written far from snow and enforced close to kids. It's about how a community forgets the invisible work that keeps it breathing. 5 winters ago, when I bought the plow, I wasn't chasing applause. I was chasing mornings that looked like possibility instead of panic. I learned every cul-de-sac's mood, every patch that refroze at dusk, every driveway that needed a gentle touch. Now, the road between the bus and the main street had become a white argument. The HOA debated contracts. The driver debated physics. The storm debated all of us. And I debated whether help given too late still counts as help. This is the moment everything changed, the moment a rule met a blizzard and blinked. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just clear a road. It exposed who we were when the snow refused to listen. The HOA meeting had been scheduled weeks before the blizzard, a tidy square on a digital calendar that assumed weather obeyed reminders. By the time the bus stalled, the board members were already gathering in the clubhouse, sipping coffee and arguing about budgets while snow stitched the windows shut. I walked in last, boots dripping, face still cold from the porch. They started with policy, liability, approved vendors, risk assessments. They said my plow was unauthorized equipment, as if metal and salt had suddenly turned dangerous. I listened, counting breaths, watching the president underline phrases on a laminated sheet. Outside, the bus driver waited with a radio that only spoke static. A mother stood up and said her son was on that bus. A father said the road had never been this bad when I plowed it. Someone else said rules kept us safe. The words stacked like snowbanks, each one making the street harder to see. I told them the truth. I'd stopped because they told me to stop. I told them I could clear the lane in 20 minutes if they lifted the ban. Silence landed heavier than the storm. The treasurer asked for a vote. Hands rose, hesitant and slow, as if lifting them required permission from the clouds. The motion failed by 1 vote. Outside, headlights blurred into halos. The bus rocked when the wind leaned on it. Kids pressed faces to fogged glass, tracing letters that vanished before they could finish spelling help. The driver tried reverse, then forward, then nothing. A tow truck refused the road. A contractor promised arrival after nightfall, maybe. People looked at me again. Not as a neighbor, not as the guy who fixed their ruts at dawn, but as a lever they didn't want to pull. I felt the old urge to act anyway, to cut through paper with steel and call it service. I also felt the new weight of being told no, of being blamed for obeying. So I waited. I waited through a second vote that tied. I waited while the president called legal counsel who didn't answer. I waited while a volunteer fire crew said they could extract kids one by one, a plan that sounded brave and slow. The storm kept writing its argument across the road. When the bus door finally opened, it was not for rescue. It was for breath. Cold air rushed in, and a small voice asked if we were lost. No one answered right away. We were all trying to find the line between doing the right thing and being allowed to do it. By dusk, the blizzard had turned the neighborhood into a bowl of chalk. Sound vanished first, then color. The bus sat half buried, its red lights blinking like tired eyes. Parents formed a crooked line from the clubhouse to the curb, passing blankets, thermoses, and quiet apologies. Every step sank to the ankle, and every breath tasted like metal. The fire crew returned with sleds. They opened the bus door and guided the smallest kids down first, wrapping them like parcels and sliding them through the drifted lane. It worked, but slowly. Each trip took 10 minutes, and the wind stole 5 more. The driver kept counting heads, whispering numbers into his glove like a prayer. I stayed back, hands in pockets, feeling the weight of my machine waiting in the garage. A neighbor nudged me and said this was getting ridiculous. Another said rules were rules. A third said children were not rules. The storm made its own decision by piling higher. Inside the clubhouse, the board argued again. Someone suggested an emergency exception. Someone else warned of precedent. They used words like exposure and indemnify while a kid outside coughed. The president looked at me and asked if I would help if the ban were lifted, temporarily. The word temporary sounded like a promise that could melt. I said I would help if the road was mine to clear, not a loophole to blame. The room went quiet. A clock ticked. A pen rolled. The vote happened faster this time, as if speed could undo the hours already lost. The motion passed. I walked back through the snow with a strange calm, the kind you feel before a race or a confession. In the garage, the plow's lights cut a clean rectangle into the white. The engine answered like it had been waiting to speak. I eased onto the street and let the blade find its work. Steel met drift. The first push opened a narrow vein of asphalt. The second widened it. Snow folded to the sides like pages turning. Parents cheered, then fell quiet, watching the road reappear as if it had been hiding all along. The bus driver honked once, grateful and embarrassed. In 20 minutes, the lane connected to the main road. The last sled came back empty. The kids rode home in a caravan of cars with heaters and stories. The storm kept falling, but it no longer owned the street. No one clapped. A few people said thank you. The president said we'd talk later. I shut off the engine and listened to the snow tick against the hood, thinking about how fast a community can forget the path it needs until it disappears. Morning revealed the street like a scar, 2 clean lines of asphalt bordered by frozen walls. The bus route reopened, and life pretended it had never been interrupted. I walked the lane with a shovel, knocking down edges the plow missed, listening to doors open behind me. Neighbors waved like survivors of the same storm, unsure whether to celebrate or apologize. The HOA posted a notice by noon. It thanked residents for patience and announced a review of snow policies. No mention of the ban, no mention of the vote, no mention of the night when rules bent. Just a promise of a committee. I folded the paper and felt the old itch of being useful replaced by the new ache of being managed. At the mailbox, the bus driver stopped his rig and leaned out. He said the kids called me the Snow Knight. He laughed, embarrassed to repeat it, but he did anyway. A girl had drawn a plow with wings and taped it to her seat. I told him heroes shouldn't need permission, and he told me heroes should charge overtime. The president knocked that evening. He carried a binder and an apology. He said they worried about insurance and optics and setting examples. I said examples are set when people are cold. We sat on opposite sides of a small table and tried to name the thing between us. He wanted a contract. I wanted trust. He wanted language. I wanted latitude. We sketched a compromise on the back of an envelope. I could plow under an emergency clause, they would list me as a vendor, and the board would sleep better. The storm outside tapped the window as if voting again. We shook hands, not because the problem was solved, but because the road was visible. Weeks passed. Snow came and went. I plowed when called and stopped when not. The kids waved from the bus. The committee met and met. The rules grew longer. The drifts grew familiar. Somewhere between those facts, a lesson hardened like ice under salt. Communities love systems until the system needs a person. They love fairness until fairness needs judgment. They love safety until safety needs speed. The blizzard didn't create our conflict. It exposed it, the way winter exposes pipes. I keep the plow ready. I keep the email printed. I keep the envelope in a drawer. When the sky darkens and the forecast turns urgent, I listen for the quiet moment before the first flake falls, the moment when a choice can still be made without a meeting. That night taught me that roads are not just paths, they are promises. And promises, like streets, have to be cleared again and again, or someone small will be stranded behind glass, waiting for adults to decide what matters. Spring arrived like an apology, dripping from roofs and carrying grit to the drains. The HOA finally delivered a contract, thick with clauses and thin with trust. It named me an approved vendor, defined emergencies, and described my plow as if it were a wild animal that required a leash. I read every line twice, tasting the words liability and indemnify until they lost meaning. At the signing table, the president slid the paper toward me with a practiced smile. He said this would prevent another incident. I said incidents are prevented by action, not ink. He said action needs authorization. I said snow does not recognize authority. We signed anyway, because winter would be back and children would still ride buses. The first test came sooner than expected. A late March squall painted the street in silver, just enough to be dangerous and not enough to justify panic. I waited for the call that didn't come. The contract required a trigger. 2 inches, sustained precipitation, a formal request. The bus skidded at the corner and stopped. No blizzard this time, just a quiet slide and a radio that asked for help politely. I stood at the window with the contract in my hand, counting inches on the railing. 1.8, 1.9. A neighbor texted a picture of tire tracks shaped like question marks. I called the president. He called the treasurer. The treasurer called the lawyer. Snow kept falling like it was being paid by the hour. When the trigger finally tripped, I rolled out with the calm of a clerk and the speed of a thief. 10 minutes later the lane was clear. The bus moved. The rules had been obeyed. The risk had been managed. The time had been lost. That afternoon, a boy left a note in my mailbox. It said thanks for the road and drew a bus smiling. I pinned it above the workbench, next to the envelope and the email. 3 artifacts of the same lesson, written in different languages. The contract made me safer and slower. It made the board braver and later. It gave us a system that worked most days and failed on the day that mattered. I learned to read clouds the way lawyers read footnotes, searching for the moment when nature outruns permission. We didn't fight after that. We negotiated. We adjusted thresholds. We added a line about discretion. The word looked small, but it felt like a door. Winter, patient as ever, kept its own calendar. Every storm after that carried the echo of the first blizzard, reminding us that procedures can clear paths, but only people decide when to start the engine and who should be waiting on the curb in silence again. Someone filmed the bus that first night, a shaky clip of red lights blinking through white noise. They posted it with a caption about rules and storms, and the internet did what it does best. It chose a side and sharpened it. By morning, the video had crossed the town line, then the county line, then the idea of lines altogether. Reporters called the HOA office. A radio host called me a folk hero and a menace in the same sentence. Neighbors who had barely waved before now asked for interviews on their porches. One woman said the ban proved bureaucracy was colder than snow. Another said I should never have waited. A third said waiting was the point. The bus driver refused to speak, but his silence sounded like testimony. The president issued a statement about safety and process. The storm issued nothing and kept its secrets. I learned what it feels like to be described by strangers. They said I quit out of spite. They said I stood my ground for kids. They said I loved the drama. They said I hated rules. None of them had watched the flakes erase the road while a clock argued with a conscience. None of them had felt a shovel become a gavel in their hands. The board scheduled a town hall. The room filled with coats and cameras. People spoke about trust like it was a bridge and about fear like it was weather. A teacher said systems exist because people make mistakes. A mechanic said people exist because systems fail. The vote to amend the policy passed with applause, then with sighs. After that, the storms felt different. Each one arrived with an audience. Plowing became performance, and silence became suspicion. I did the work the same way, blade down, lights on, corners wide. But I felt the lens even when there wasn't one, felt the story walking beside the truck like a shadow. One night, During a small snowfall no one reported, I cleared the street early. The bus rolled through without drama. Kids waved. No one posted anything. The quiet tasted better than praise. It reminded me that most roads are kept by people who never trend. Fame is a snowbank that melts unevenly. It leaves grit in places you didn't expect and clean lines where you did. The board and I settled into a truce shaped like a checklist. The contract grew annotations. The envelope stayed in the drawer. The note from the boy stayed on the wall. The story kept spreading, but the work kept returning. And with every push of the blade, I remembered the first lesson the storm taught us. When rules freeze, people thaw them, and when people freeze, rules can't move at all. The next winter arrived without spectacle, just a steady fall that felt like a test written in small print. The policy was updated, the contract renewed, and the emergency clause polished until it shone like a badge. Everyone said we were ready. Readiness, I learned, is a word that sounds confident and behaves like a question. The first big storm hit on a Tuesday, the kind that begins politely and then refuses to leave. I woke before dawn, listening to the wind brush the siding and counting inches on the porch rail. The trigger was close. My phone stayed quiet. Somewhere, a spreadsheet was deciding. By 7, the bus route was already frosting over. I drove to the corner and watched tires skate where salt should have been. A mother waited with her daughter, both of them wrapped in colors too bright for the gray morning. The girl asked if the snow knight was coming today. I told her the knight was checking his orders. Back home, I read the contract again. The emergency clause said I could act when delay created risk. The definition of risk ran 3 paragraphs and ended with a comma. I imagined the bus stuck again, imagined the clip replayed, imagined the board meeting with coffee and blame. I also imagined the road clear and the story ending before it began. I started the engine. The blade cut through the first drift like a sentence that finally found its verb. I worked the corners and the hill, opening the lane before the plows from the city could reach us. When the bus came, it passed cleanly, its lights bright and ordinary. The girl waved from the window, and the mother mouthed thank you with the seriousness of someone signing something invisible. My phone rang 10 minutes later. The president said I had acted without a formal call. I said the clause allowed it. He said the lawyer would review. I said the road was clear. Silence took a turn in the conversation and won. At the next board meeting, they debated whether my choice had been correct or merely fortunate. A teacher said fortune favors preparation. A neighbor said preparation favors people who are allowed to prepare. The motion to reprimand failed. The motion to clarify passed. Words shifted like snow. Afterward, the president and I stood by the door, listening to flakes tap the glass. He said systems exist to keep us from guessing. I said storms exist to remind us we still must. We shook hands, not because we agreed, but because the bus had made it home. That winter, we found a rhythm. Sometimes I waited, sometimes I didn't. Every storm asked the same question in a different accent: who gets to decide when help is needed? The answer was never written all the way down. It lived in the space between a clause and a child at a curb. By the third winter after the blizzard, the story had faded into something neighbors told new residents when the forecast looked serious. The video still lived online, but the comments were buried under newer arguments. What remained was a routine shaped by memory. I watched the sky. The board watched the metrics. Somewhere between us, the road waited. One afternoon, the bus driver stopped at my driveway and killed the engine. He brought a thermos and a folded schedule. He said the kids were older now, but they still remembered the night they learned snow could stop a bus. He said the route had been adjusted to avoid the steepest corner, and the city had added an extra salt run when storms were predicted. He said small changes were easier to make when people admitted they had been wrong once. The HOA didn't announce a new policy that year. They didn't need to. They called when the sky looked heavy. I plowed when the call came and sometimes before it did. No votes, no statements, just a text that said, "Can you?" And a reply that said, "On my way." The contract stayed in the file, but it felt like a spare tire, not a steering wheel. During one storm, I saw a man shoveling alone at the end of the block, shoulders bent like a question. I stopped and helped him finish. He said he had moved from a place where no one waited for permission to clear a path. I said people wait for different reasons. We both laughed, the kind of laugh that makes steam. At the bus stop, a girl handed me a drawing. It showed a road with lines and a truck with a face. Underneath, she wrote, "So we can go." The words were crooked and perfect. I put the drawing next to the first one on the wall, a small gallery of winters. The president retired that spring. A new board came in with fresh binders and careful voices. They asked about the emergency clause. I told them about the night the bus waited and the morning the road appeared. I told them rules are maps and storms are mountains. They nodded and wrote it down as if it were a statistic. Nothing dramatic happened that year. That was the victory. The bus ran on time. The lane stayed open. The snow fell and was moved. The work was ordinary, and the ordinary felt earned. We didn't solve the argument between systems and people. We learned how to pause it long enough to get home. The quiet agreement was not written, but it was practiced. It lived in the sound of a blade scraping and in the brief wave from a window. It lived in the idea that help doesn't always wait to be approved, and approval doesn't always arrive in time. Years later, when storms arrive with names and maps, I still measure them by how they treat our street. The plow waits by the door like a coat, and the bus still hums past at the same hour. People have moved, kids have grown, and the committee has become a different committee with the same chairs. Only the snow behaves the same, falling without regard for bylaws. Sometimes I think about the night the bus stopped and how close we came to learning the wrong lesson. It would have been easy to decide that rules are enemies or that obedience is virtue. Instead, we learned something narrower and truer. Roads need caretakers, and caretakers need room to decide. The space between those two ideas is where a community breathes. On the anniversary of the blizzard, the driver left a card in my mailbox. It showed a road under stars and said thank you for keeping it open. I pinned it next to the drawings. 3 winters of paper have become a map of their own, tracing the path from fear to habit. The board still files reports. I still keep receipts. But when the sky turns heavy, the first message is not a form. It is a question. Are you watching this? I answer, yes. That exchange clears more snow than salt ever could. People ask if I regret shutting off the engine that first morning. I tell them I regret the waiting, not the stopping. Waiting is where doubt grows tall. Stopping is where a line is drawn. The storm crossed it. We had to decide what lines meant. Every town has a story like this, a small winter that reveals a big shape. Ours taught us that help can be both authorized and urgent, and that urgency should not be punished for arriving early. It taught us that safety is not only a policy but a practice, performed with hands and judgment and the courage to be visible. When the bus passes now, it looks ordinary. That is the reward. No blinking lights, no crowds, no arguments about inches. Just a road doing what roads do and people going where they need to go. Ordinary is what happens when extraordinary choices are remembered. If you listen on a quiet morning, you can hear the blade long before you see it. A steady scrape that says the path is being kept. The road remembers that sound. It remembers the night it was lost and the morning it was found. And it keeps asking the same simple thing of us. Decide in time.